In this third episode of a three-part look at the Satanic Rituals, we'll look at each of the remaining rituals of the book that we haven't covered yet, from 1920s science fiction cinema to electricity and synthesized sound frequencies, to the dark deities of Russian folklore, to the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, to Satanic Baptisms, to the satanic significance of the number 9. There is a lot to explore in this third and final look at the Satanic Rituals here on Satansplain.
Well, it's not Satan worship, it's Satanism. It's embracing the life-enriching things which have traditionally been given the devil's name. Pride, lust, earthly success, rational self-interest, atheism, humor, nonconformity, science, a passion for living, being selective about whom we love. We don't see these as shameful sins, but empowering ideals. And we also recognize the psychological power and fun of symbolism and aesthetics, so we utilize Satan as mythology's most fitting mascot for what we're about.
Satansplain, Satanic Talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. In episode 80 of Satansplain, we took a quick look at the book The Satanic Rituals with an overview of its history and correcting some misconceptions about satanic ritual. Then in episode 81, we took a closer look at the rituals themselves. And now here in episode 82, we'll finish off our exploration of the Satanic Rituals with a look at the remaining parts of the book that we have not covered yet. So if you have not listened to parts 1 and 2 yet, I suggest you stop and listen to those first before continuing now to part 3. I'm going to assume that most of you listening have already done that, so let's continue with our look at the 1972 book, The Satanic Rituals. In part 2, we covered the satanic lore about the Black Mass, the Illuminati, stories like Faust, the Yazidis, and some other topics. So what are some other so-called satanic rituals out there that might spring into the mind of somebody picking up this book in a bookstore in 1972? Well, to this day, we still see idiots calling Aleister Crowley a Satanist, even though he wasn't a Satanist. He had a religion that wasn't called Satanism. He never called himself a Satanist. And the people who do practice the religion he created, Philema, do not consider themselves nor Crowley to be Satanists. But if we do look at what Crowley was doing before he set up his own thing, he was in a group called the OTO, a secret order that came out of either Germany or Austria. Now, what other stuff was going on in Germany in the early half of the 20th century? Well, I know some people will be quick to say, oh, Hitler, the Third Reich. Yeah, okay, that's true. But first of all, that wasn't until the 1930s. And second of all, World War II was not the only thing that ever happened in Germany and Austria in those decades. I mean, the name World War II should be a reminder that there was a whole other world war before that in the 1910s. But there was much more going on in Germany before and after World War I. There was this relatively new medium in the world called motion pictures, and with that came German films in science fiction and horror. Think of silent films like Nosferatu, or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or the classic movie Metropolis. And we see those dark themes show up in art from around this time, Expressionism, as it was called, and Expressionist dance, as well as Expressionist paintings. There were other art movements like Surrealism, with the famous This Is Not a Pipe painting and what have you. But in Germany, it seemed to be more about Expressionism, not Surrealism, from what I know. So think more like paintings like Edvard Munch's The Scream. That particular painting was technically the 1890s, not the early 1900s, but you get the idea. There was Expressionist music as well, along with some of the first attempts at electronic music. That wasn't exclusive to Germany. You had the theremin, which came out of the Soviet Union, as well as American inventors with some of the first synthesizers. But in Germany, you had Friedrich Trautwein and his musical synthesizer of sorts called the Trautonium. Also, well by this time, there was the invention of the cathode ray tube, Albert Einstein and some of his big accomplishments that shattered some of the assumptions about reality that humans had held. Also figures like Sigmund Freud and the practice of psychoanalysis, or Wilhelm Reich, who was not only doing psychoanalysis, but experimenting with this concept called orgone and building orgone cabinets and the like. Now, you could argue that some of the things I listed in there turned out to be pseudoscience in the long run, but nevertheless, out of Germany in this period, well before the Nazis, you had all this exploration of the occult with electricity and dark aesthetics and cinematography. Did some of that spill over into the Nazis? Well, yeah, plenty have written about the occult ideas being appropriated by the Nazis. But these symbols, like the swastika and the wolf's angle and the black sun, they weren't invented by the Nazis. They each have a much older history than all of that. Furthermore, the fact that so many idiots don't know any better and freak out and dismiss anything remotely German like this as Nazism. Well, just like the irrational taboos about the number 666, maybe we can take some of that fear and make it work for us. Regardless, before the Nazis ever showed up, you had Germanic symbols, Germanic horror cinema, Germanic occultism, the experiments of electricity and sound frequencies and geometry on the psyche. Can we take all of that stuff and frame it in a thrilling satanic context? You bet we can. And that's what we get with Die Elektrischen Vorspiele. That's German for the electrical prelude or the electrical prologue. As the introduction to this ritual explains, you can perform this ritual alone. It does not have to be a group ritual. You can perform this as a solitary ritual. But whether you perform it alone or with a group, I would say you have to take some safety precautions to be sure, because this ritual makes use of having either a Van de Graaff generator or a Tesla coil in the room, not to mention neon lights and other items. So there is the risk of electric shock if you're not really careful with things. Be an adult, take precautions. And it also calls for the placement of mirrors around the area in the form of a pentagram. This is not the same as a circle of protection you might see a Wiccan making with salt. No, you can read the description for yourself. It's more about defining the ritual chamber and symbolically reflecting things back onto yourself. So to read you some more details about the setup from the book, quote, "The unclad woman who customarily serves as a living altar is not required in Die Elektrischen Vorspiele. In her place, a human skull, also known in Germanic lore as the Totenkopf, rests upon a scarlet cushion. In this ritual, as in all other satanic rites, the skull serves as a reminder of the material, flesh and bone godhead that is man, rather than as a symbol of mortality. It also represents the vault of wisdom from whence all human ideas and developments emerge, the temple of invention, both material and spiritual. A candlestick bearing a black candle is placed at each side of the skull. The chalice rests directly in front of the skull with the bell and the phallus to either side. The sword rests parallel to the front edge of the platform. The wall above the altar displays the sigil of Satan. Now, when you read this whole ritual setup in full, it may sound really elaborate and require a lot of special setup, but it's far from being an impossible thing to set up and do. Another thing that this ritual utilizes is synthesizer sounds. LaVey lists different suggested frequencies in terms of CPS, which stands for cycles per second. That's an older term for what we now call hertz, the unit of hertz, Hertz. It means the same thing. You don't actually need to buy an elaborate synthesizer to generate these sorts of sounds at specific frequencies, by the way. If you have a computer or even a smartphone, there is software out there, there are apps out there you can use to generate these customized frequencies. And this is what we do in the experimental band that I play in. I play with a band. And I noticed that LaVey says to use sounds at 30, 45, and 60 hertz to make a sound like thunder. Curiously enough, those sound ratios are the same as what's called the power chord in music, the root fifth octave notes, which is the standard type of chord used in heavy metal and punk music and the like. I don't think that's why he chose it here, but it does amuse me to think that almost every punk or heavy metal song is, in theory, using a chord with the same frequency as ratios as the one used in the Elektrischen Vorspiele from the Satanic Rituals. Anyway, To share another quick line from Magus Peter H. Gilmore's essay, The Right to Stuff, quote, "From Germany, the fount of eerie expressionist cinema, which explored the dark intersections of human feelings, LaVey presented two ceremonies with cinematic inspiration. And as he explains, Das Teardrama was inspired by The Island of Lost Souls, which in turn was based on the book The Island of Dr. Moreau, and Die Elektrischen Vorspiele was inspired by the film Metropolis. Though I also mentioned the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I think that was also some inspiration here, especially when it comes to geometry. Speaking of movies, as I mentioned before, you have the title page of the book, and I suppose the Black Mass as well, as being inspired from the film The Black Cat. So all four of the movies I just mentioned are not surprisingly part of the Church of Satan suggested film list. You can find that in full on churchofsatan.com. Look under resources and film list. But, another movie on that same suggested film list is Fantasia. Yes, the animated Disney movie. And if you're wondering why that movie's on the list, well, I would say just watch the Night on Bald Mountain segment. It was, in fact, a partial inspiration for the next ritual in the book that we're going to talk about. From The Right Stuff, quote, "The homage to Tchort was inspired by Disney's boldly rendered Chernobog from Fantasia, which had led LaVey to seek out the Russian mythology, which inspired Mussorgsky's Infernal Tone poem." Before we get to that next ritual, I want to address something. So, I just spent a lot of time talking about the Elektrischen Vorspiele. I talked about its inspiration and what it utilizes. But as I said, there are still idiots out there who, no matter what I say, will fall into this mindset of, oh, it's from Germany and it involves something somewhere that some Nazi somewhere used later on, so therefore it's Nazi, and therefore you Satanists are all neo-Nazi fascists, because anybody who uses the black sun symbol or the German skull or the wolf's angle or anything that I can link Hitler to in 6 degrees or less is a fascist. Okay. Well, to you sanctimonious whiners out there who want to think that, let me ask you this. What would make you feel better? I mean, if you're a Satanist listening to this, then by now you should understand the basics of satanic ritual and maybe should consider channeling those emotions creatively and ritualistically. Are you one of those self-described anti-fascists? A Marxist, perhaps? A socialist? Are you so obsessed with this idea of punching Nazis that you'd like to do a satanic ritual that is what you would believe to be the polar opposite of that? Well, how might a Satanist go about making such a ritual? Well, let's see. When it comes to communism, I guess that's the thing you want to support here. Okay. Well, when it comes to communism, I think of its birthplace, which is Russia, and surely there must be some dark folklore that's Russian in origin that a Satanist might be able to utilize in a ritual setting. When we look at the Bolshevik Revolution and some of the precursors to that, a curious figure we stumble across is Rasputin. Rasputin certainly had some mysterious occult stuff going on. Gee, if only there was some already written satanic ritual that Satanists might be able to utilize to that end. Oh, well, look at that. There's one starting on the very next fucking page in the book. Welcome to Night on Bald Mountain, the homage to Tchort, the next ritual in the Satanic Rituals. As the chapter begins, quote, "Few scholars have explored the existence of devil worship in Russia during the hundreds of years its pagan spirit was enthralled to the Orthodox Church. If questions were asked, the answer was invariably that Russian black magic was either non-existent or a discipline cloaked in Christian euphemism. The latter assumption, of course, is the most accurate. There is no culture more steeped in dark forces and deities than the Slavonic in general and the Russian in particular. The proportion of satanic entities in Slavonic mythology far exceeds the usual quota. What is remarkable is that Unlike the shunned forces of darkness so often encountered in mythology and religion, Russian devils were regarded with great reverence or enjoyment. For this reason, the Christian Church had a very difficult time fighting the devil in its Eastern Rite. The persistence of Satan, especially among the Muzhiks peasants in the early days of the Russian religious orthodoxy, required a revamping of the old gods that made Roman Christian transitional techniques pale by comparison. And LaVey goes on from here to describe some of these gods of Russian pagan mythology and the people who revered them, and a lot about the life of Rasputin. I'm not going to say much more about the ritual itself. You can get the book and read about it yourself. I will say, though, that this is another ritual which you may be able to pull off as a solitary one. Forget having the altar of flesh and just do all the reading parts and gong striking and stuff yourself. It is pretty much, like a lot of these rituals, following the standard satanic ritual format, the standard kind of 13-step ritual in some kind of different order, but having different readings to it and different trappings. In this case, Russian mythology. But Bill, Homage Tchort ritual is not a communist ritual. Well, the Elektrischen Vorspiele isn't a Nazi ritual, so there you have it. Let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the other satanic rituals in the Satanic Rituals, including ones based on the mythology of H.P. Lovecraft. Stay tuned, you are listening to Satansplain.
You are listening to Satansplain, real satanic talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M. For questions, comments, and correspondence, send an email to bill@satansplain.com.
Do satanic cults lurk in the shadows? Can memories of satanic ritual abuse be repressed? Do exorcisms really drive out demons? And are those demons always possessing Zach Baggins? I'm JD Sword, the Satanic Skeptic. Join me on The Devil in the Details as I examine these questions and more, bringing a skeptical and satanic perspective to the paranormal. The Devil in the Details, available on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, and more.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Visit the main website for the show at satansplain.com. There you can find every episode of Satansplain. You can also listen to Satansplain on Spotify, YouTube, Audible, and a host of other places. If you're on social media, please give Satansplain a like and a follow, whatever the equivalent is, on Facebook, X, and YouTube. Likewise, if you're listening now on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button for this episode. For all questions and correspondence, email me directly. The address is bill@satansplain.com. If you enjoy Satansplain and would like to support the show, please go to the show's page on Locals. Point your web browsers to satansplain.locals.com. You can sign up for Locals for free, but you can also additionally become a paid subscriber there, and that is the best way you can support Satansplain. Though we also have a merch store. You can go to store.satansplain.com for that. And thank you, as always, to all of you who support Satansplain in one way or another. I talked earlier about things people erroneously associate with satanic ritual and how we as Satanists can actually turn those around and make them work for us. Another one of these ideas you may have heard of is the Necronomicon. This is a supposed book of all this magical occult power and a whole bunch of legends and the lore surrounding it. Is there any truth to all of this? Well, the short answer is no. The idea of a book called the Necronomicon seems to all trace back to the imagination of famous horror fiction writer H.P. Lovecraft, who died in 1937. He had some stories he wrote about the Necronomicon and all of these details about it, like how there are supposedly only 5 copies in the world, and they're kept in these 5 places. Apparently, some people believed him, and it sparked this whole lore and these urban myths that persist to this day. In fact, sometime in the 1970s, when his work was getting such a revival, a publisher by the name of Simon published a paperback book called The Necronomicon to cash in on this demand. I still have my copy that I bought when I was a curious teenager, and I think if you stumble across a book called the Necronomicon in a store, it's typically that one. So, what is the satanic take here on Lovecraft? I suppose you could say that Satan is essentially a character associated with horror and scary things, so it's another source of imagery and mythology with Lovecraft that we can use to resonate with this idea of Satanists and Satanism being dark and taboo and outside the norm for the principles it embraces. Yeah, but there's a little more to it than that. So there are 2 rituals in the Satanic Rituals which are based on the mythology created by H.P. Lovecraft. And let me read you now some of the introduction to this section. I'm going to start at the beginning, but skip around. Quote, "Even to his most intimate acquaintances, Howard Phillips Lovecraft remained frustratingly enigmatic. From the pen of this ingenious New Englander came a collection of the most convincing and thoroughly terrifying works of macabre fiction in modern times. His tales were uniquely embellished with painstaking pseudo-documentation and meticulous descriptions of character and setting." So pseudo-documentation, for example, being, the fake details about the Necronomicon. "It is frequently said that once one has read Lovecraft, one disdains the efforts of the competition. This statement has been consistently difficult to refute. Lovecraft created his own beings whose prehistoric activities on Earth set in motion the forces of man's civilization and genius, as well as the horrors of his educated imagination. While Freud and Einstein wrestled with their respective disciplines in the isolation of academic specialization, Lovecraft was describing the astonishing influence of physical and geometric law on the psyche. While he might have hesitated to style himself as a master of scientific speculation, he is no less deserving of that title than are the authors Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. What has puzzled many of Lovecraft's admirers is the author's almost casual attitude towards his work. He repeatedly referred to it as a mere means of financial subsistence. To people who suspected he entertained a private belief in the mythos, he would reply that an objective detachment from one's material was necessary for effective writing. As an author, Lovecraft enjoys an established reputation, but what of Lovecraft the philosopher? Perhaps the most significant clues to the philosophy in the Cthulhu mythos derive from the author's fascination with human history, particularly that of the classical eras. That much of his work used material taken from Egyptian and Arabian legends is well known. There is evidence that he was acutely aware of civilization's effects upon mankind, both educational and repressive. His tales constantly remind the reader that humanity is but a short step from the most depraved and vicious forms of bestiality. I think bestiality here means more like bestialism and not sexual bestiality per se, but anyway. He sensed man's drive toward knowledge even at the risk of sanity. Intellectual excellence, he seemed to say, is achieved in concert with the cataclysmic terror, not in avoidance of it. This theme of a constant interrelationship between the constructive and destructive facets of the human personality is the keystone of the doctrines of Satanism. Theism argues that the integrity of the individual can be increased by a rejection of the carnal and an obedience to morality. And just to pause reading here for a second, I keep running into idiots who claim that LaVey wasn't an atheist and that he was really a theist and that it was Magus Peter H. Gilmore that somehow changed the Church of Satan into an atheist thing. This is complete bullshit, of course. Satanism has always been non-theistic, and I had a whole episode on this. And right here, for example, we have Anton LaVey explicitly condemning theism, not atheism. So allow me to reread that sentence again and continue. Theism argues that the integrity of the individual can be increased by a rejection of the carnal and an obedience to morality. Lovecraft recorded his aversion to conventional religious dogmas in The Silver Key, and he regarded with a similar scorn those who, rejecting religion, succumbed to a controversial substitute, for example, the popular notion of witchcraft. The concept of worship, per se, is strikingly absent from the Cthulhu mythos. Compare the description of a Lovecraftian ceremony to that of a Christian mass or a voodoo rite, and it is clear that the element of servitude is definitely lacking in the first. So the chapter goes on with more thoughts about Lovecraft, what specifics did he give in his stories that may describe ritual, and so on. But once again, we see that satanic ritual is not limited to the Christian mythos, nor even religions in general. And in the book here are 2 rituals based around the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft and his universe of fictional characters. The only other thing I'll mention is that as a Satanist, if you want to perform any of the rituals in this book, you are under no obligation to follow them word for word. You can take parts, leave parts, customize it. I would suggest that you realize things are structured as they are for certain reasons. A lot of careful thought went into all of these rituals. So don't let the satanic sin of counterproductive pride make you disregard structure entirely. But nevertheless, if you are looking for a ceremony that can be adapted to a solitary ritual, well, another one from this book I would suggest is the Ceremony of the 9 Angles. And that is angles, not angels. So that is one of the 2 Lovecraft rituals in this book. I suggest that one because I did this myself. I was able to perform this as a solitary ritual myself once. You'll want to walk through it first to see how it works. But yeah, you can read all the spoken parts yourself. There is a part of the ritual where the goat of 1,000 young appears. And in a group ritual context, that may mean having somebody in costume in that role appearing. But when I did it as a solitary ritual, I just found an artist rendering of that character. I printed it out, put it on an easel with a cloth over it, and then when the revealing part happens in the ritual, just remove the cloth. So this is just an example. Maybe give it a try yourself. But let's now get to the final rituals in the book, the baptisms. Now, 3 particular types of ceremonies we see in other religions are weddings, funerals, and sometimes baptisms. Why do humans have these things? Well, humans are very ritual-minded creatures, as I explained in part 1, and when it comes to important events in life, people often want to celebrate these things in ceremony. So, is there a satanic wedding ceremony? Is there a satanic funeral ceremony? The answer to both is yes. I myself have conducted both of them before. We've had these ceremonies for years in the Church of Satan. In fact, one of the first public satanic ceremonies ever was a funeral for a Church of Satan member who had also been a Navy officer. Come to think of it, that was also an example of Satanism being formally recognized by the U.S. government as a religion. Now, that was in December 1967. A little trivia bit to keep in mind the next time you see some clueless person claim that there was no satanic ritual publicly or legal recognition by the U.S. government of the religion of Satanism until the 21st century. You can say, no, December 1967, Navy funeral. Regardless, you will not find either the satanic wedding ceremony or the satanic funeral rite in the book, The Satanic Rituals. You can, however, find both of those in the book, The Satanic Scriptures, by Magus Peter H. Gilmore. Now, there was a third category of rituals I mentioned besides weddings and funerals, and that is baptisms. The satanic baptism ceremonies are, in this book, The Satanic Rituals. They are the final 2 rituals in the book. Now, I don't actually want to spend too much time talking about them because I already did a whole episode on satanic baptisms before. That was Satansplain episode number 24. So you can listen to that for more details. Rather than repeat that entire episode here, I will try to summarize this quickly. Satanism as a religion does not have baptisms or other sacraments as requirements, as you may see in some other religions. There's no particular ceremony or ceremonies you have to perform at different stages in your life as a Satanist. It's not like what you see in Catholicism with, where they have 7 sacraments and 4 of them are required. Or in Islam, you have the pillars of Islam. It's not like that. Of course, like I said, humans are a very ceremony-minded species, and we humans often want to commemorate major events by doing some kind of ceremony. So, not surprisingly, there are Satanists who feel they'd like to celebrate or express their commitment to Satanism by having a satanic baptism. I went through this ceremony myself. I got together with some local Satanists back in the late 1990s who were Church of Satan members, and I was one of the Satanists being baptized that night. I know that in the last year or so, Church of Satan Reverend Andy Howell down in Florida has been performing satanic baptisms for groups of people now and then. Notice again that these are not unbaptisms. They are not some kind of Christian thing done in reverse to try to reverse the effects of a Christian baptism or something. Satanism is its own religion with its own convictions, and this baptism is a satanic baptism. It is a rite of assertion of being on the metaphorical left-hand path. The left-hand path, that is the path of indulgence, the carnal, and the glorification of the self, as opposed to the right-hand path, which is the philosophical term for the sanctimonious path of self-sacrifice and empathy and servitude and things like that. As I said, there are 2 satanic baptism ceremonies presented here in the book. One of them is for adults, which is the one I just described. The other is for children. There is some famous press footage you can find of Anton LaVey performing the ceremony on his daughter, Xena, when she was a little girl. Now, how does a baptism for children apply within the context of Satanism? Can a child truly understand religion in general, whether it's Satanism or something else? Well, I would say the answer is no, which is why Satanists don't indoctrinate children. There are, however, plenty of Satanists who are parents of children, and although Satanism is not a religion you can raise a child under, per se, again, indoctrination is not part of Satanism. Well, still, these satanic parents want to celebrate a child of their own whom they love. They want to take pride in having brought their child into existence. Human life is not created by God. It's created by fornication. It's a biological process. It's the carnal. There is no such thing as a soul. Now, Christian baptisms typically involve the notion of washing away original sin, as if you're born dirty and you need to submit and have that cleansed from you. Satanism, however, again, is a religion of the carnal. A baby is a human in its most carnal state, free from the irrational indoctrinations of spiritual religions. So a satanic baptism for a child is not an indoctrination, but rather a celebration. And again, more so a ceremony for the parents than anybody else. So the child baptism in the book is written very differently from the adult baptism in the book. I have performed the child baptism for satanic parents before. One thing I've noticed is that this particular ritual is the shortest ritual in the book by far. I guess that makes sense. You know, you want to go through the motions and finish before the baby or the kid gets bored or hungry and starts crying, so on. As I said earlier, you can take any of these rituals from the Satanic Rituals and extract parts out of it to make a solitary ritual. I still urge you to find other Satanists to meet up with in person to perform them as the group rituals they're written for. But a solitary ritual is still better than no ritual at all. So, if you're a Satanist who is relatively new to Satanism and you want some kind of a ritual that you can use as a baptism of sorts to assert your convictions as aligning with Satanism and your commitment to this idea, you can certainly take parts of the adult baptism and work that into a separate ritual just for you. Another option, though, for that is yet another ritual which is found not in the Satanic Rituals, but rather in the book The Satanic Scriptures, and that is the Satanic Rite of Dedication. That is designed for use as a solitary ritual, and effectively means the same thing as the baptism. So that's another option. Consider that. Just to mention one more example, about 20 years ago, I had a friend who was a Satanist and wanted to do some kind of baptism ceremony or similar to ritualistically affirm his commitment to Satanism. He said more specifically that he really liked the Faust legend about signing a pact. So he and I sat down to write out some kind of affirmation in the form of a document and printed it out in a nice creepy font on some colored parchment paper. and we designed a ritual that incorporated the signing of this pact. I think we certainly took some words from the adult baptism ritual and the Satanic Rituals. But anyway, that's just another example of how you could do things. In any case, the baptisms are the last two rituals included in the Satanic Rituals. Finally, at the end of the book, we have a short essay in closing titled The Unknown Known. I'm not going to say much about this because you can read it for yourself. If you're wondering why the satanic number is 9, quote, 9 is the number of the ego, for it always returns to itself, no matter what is done through the most complex multiplication of 9 by any other number. In the final equation, 9 alone will stand forth. So you can look up the mathematics behind this. If, for example, you take any integer and multiply it by 9, then add up all the digits, then take the result of that and add up those digits and repeat, you will always end up with a result of 9. I see it as a testament to the fact that the ego and carnality can never be fully erased from a human. And no matter how much spiritual nonsense you try to program him or her with, that carnal nature can still come through in the end. It will come through when push comes to shove. Well, we've come to the end of part 3 of this 3-episode exploration of the Satanic Rituals. I'm sure this won't be the last time I ever talk about the book here on Satansplain, but I'd say 3 episodes is enough for now. I want to thank you all for listening and joining me in this exploration of a book which I suspect many of you Satanists have on your bookshelves, but perhaps haven't paid much attention to it in a while. I hope I've given you some insight, and more importantly, I hope I've given you some inspiration to get together in person with some fellow Satanists, real Satanists, and make one or more of these rituals a reality. It could be an experience you'll remember for the rest of your life. If you've enjoyed these episodes of Satansplain, once again, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on satansplain.locals.com. Otherwise, with that, I thank you for listening. Hail Satan.
You have been listening to Satansplain. For more information about the show, visit the official website at satansplain.com. And for more information about Satanism itself, visit churchofsatan.com. This episode, copyright 2025, Magister Bill M.